Abbas Kiarostami is one of the most interesting directors to have ever worked. But if you don't know what kind of tricks to expect in his movies, you're likely to be bored and confused. Kiarostami's films are ontologically baffling, ambiguous nearly to the point of destruction, bordering on narrative self-sabotage. For example, when you watch the film Close Up, it's very difficult to tell if you're watching a fictional film or a documentary. The film is about a person who impersonates the Iranian director Mohsen Makhmalbaf and tricks a family into making a movie with him. So the ambiguous form is deeply tied to some of the themes of the plot, some of the ideas of deception in entertainment and such. Kiarostami is not tricky for the sake of being tricky. He uses ambiguity to probe the world and tease out ideas that would be difficult to see and to understand otherwise. Taste of Cherry is another one of his pretty well-known films. It masquerades as a traditional and somewhat moralistic film, but at the last second, it completely subverts itself and gives us a completely different view of some of the traditional values and legends that it depicts. Certified Copy is also a tricky film. This is a much newer film from 2010. It's made in Europe with a bunch of fairly famous actors. Even just from the title, you can kind of tell it's a bit tricky. A certified copy, a bit of an oxymoron, surely. From the title, you might think that this is a postmodern movie, or a movie about postmodernism. A lot of these theories are a bit obsessed with copying things, copies of copies of copies, and there's a lot of movies about this, a lot of movies focused on copying. But this movie is actually more focused on traditional institutions, art, marriage, love. Cell phones play a role, but it's somewhat subtle. We'll come back to it. There are a lot of other movies about copies, like F for Fake. It's an interesting comparison, but many of them are more in the postmodern realm, like Blade Runner. This movie is nothing like that, much more traditional. The trick in this movie, there is a trick, concerns the two central characters. There's a big ambiguity here. I'm not going to give it away. It's not an earth-shattering twist, but it's a somewhat odd shift that continually defies your assumptions and really defies your ability to ground the plot. It's destabilizing. And if you don't know what to expect, it might be a bit maddening. Otherwise, I think it's actually quite fun to see how Kiarostami has done it this time, to see his trick. I think it's a lot of fun if you kind of know what you're in for. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. The beginning of this movie is interesting. I think it exemplifies the subtle intricacies that really define Kiarostami's film. So the movie opens with waiting. It opens with a table that's set for a book talk. An author is going to talk about his work, but he's not here yet. He's running late. So we just sit and we watch the table for a little bit, and then we hear somebody introduce the author before he gets there, and then we wait a bit more. Normally, movies start at the beginning, right? They start when the action starts. They don't start and then leave us waiting. Why would we start the movie just to wait? I mean, we were just waiting for the movie to start. Now we're waiting for the movie to start, even though it started. This isn't earth-shattering. It's not some crazy twist, but it's a bit of a twist on how things are normally done, a bit of a shifting of the boundaries of the screen, a little bit of a tug on what a movie tends to be and the grammar that defines it. Kiarostami, very well known for this kind of thing. Who are we waiting for? An author named James Miller, I think. I think that's his name, who's written a book called Certified Copy and is going to give a talk about it, maybe even sign a few of the certified copies. He shows up eventually and starts giving the talk, talking about how an original maybe wouldn't have meaning if it weren't for copies that have been made of it, talking about how the term original relates etymologically to birth. The camera doesn't really seem to focus on the author, though. Instead, we see a little bit of drama in the audience where Juliette Binoche is attending with her son. Juliette Binoche's character in this film, by the way, doesn't have a name, so I will probably going to refer to her as Juliette Binoche, even though that's the name of the actress, not the name of the character. Like I said, character has no name. So the son, who might have a name, I just don't remember it, is bored, hungry, he wants to leave. He signals over to his mother, sort of nagging her with hand gestures. And she says, wait, 5 minutes, hold on. She wants to stay. Again, Kiarostami is a little bit up to his tricks. Why aren't we watching the talk? Surely that's the focus of attention. Why are we so enthralled in this seemingly inconsequential action? In some ways, it's familiar, of course, to be bored during a talk or to be nagged. to watch this happen to other people, to be distracted. Very common form of viewership, common in movies even. But there's a bit more to it than that. Once Juliette Binoche and her son leave, they go get some food, and they end up discussing and analyzing with quite a bit of precision exactly what just happened, going over this interaction. The son accuses the mother, who turns out to be single, of being there just because she wants to meet the actor, or the author. He accuses her of giving her number to the translator of the book, who is sitting next to her and is in contact with the author. They debate. They go back and forth. And now we see, this is why Kiarostami was showing us this. It actually is going to be relevant in the plot now. It's this little dramatic linchpin of the film, to some extent, what this interaction was exactly. And as the movie goes on, we realize that the mother and son, as mentioned, first in its relation with originality and birth, right, in the talk itself, that is going to become a bigger and bigger theme of the movie. It's an interesting relationship, by the way, between the mother and son here. The child is a bit of a brat, but they have a connection. So this is kind of what I mean by the subtle intricacies in Kiarostami's films. Like a lot of so-called art films, his movies require a different level of focus. Since everything moves so slowly, you kind of have no choice but to wonder about all these little things, a bit like the people watching the talk. Your eyes and your mind may wander a little bit thinking about all the details. Kiarostami is a great director because it is rewarding to pay attention to his movies. When you engage with a film like this at that level, you get a lot back. Of course, for some people, this movie is just going to be impenetrably boring. So you probably know who you are already. We're getting ahead of ourselves again. There's an interesting question about this movie, which is whether or not you are supposed to take the characters seriously, take them at face value. It's not totally obvious. I think the answer is not really. Sometimes when you watch an art film, you might be tempted to latch onto things that characters say as a big hint for the director's ideas about the movie, as somebody speaking the moral of the film, somebody telling you what it's all about. And sometimes, I guess this might happen, but often the characters aren't all that wise, and they're only a piece of a much more complicated story. They only tell you one point of view, or perhaps they exemplify something the director thinks is completely wrong. It can be hard sometimes to know, because usually when you go to watch a movie, you kind of assume, this is the main character. They're probably going to know stuff. They're probably going to be right. I should root, for them to some extent. I don't know. In this movie, James Miller takes the stage and begins confidently talking about copies and originals. Are we supposed to be paying attention to this? Well, the camera isn't really. It's showing us these other things. It's showing us the audience. This is undermining his authority, his significance to some extent. Different people might read this character a little bit differently, but to me it seems fairly clear that he is to some extent performing here. He's infatuated with his own performance as well. Likes hearing the sound of his own voice. He's practiced this talk. He's practiced even the offhand remarks in the talk, even the things that are supposed to seem more real are probably rehearsed. He is trying, to some extent, to sell his own authority via superficial means here. For instance, he's not an academic art historian. He's a guy who wrote a book. Now, the lines are blurry about how you actually create value in the world, right? What words are meaningful, what words are worth paying for and reading about and devoting your time to or something. But to some extent, he has to do a bit of work by cultivating his image, his persona, the way he speaks, the way he presents himself, and the way he presents his work. Those cultivate the value of the work to some extent. You can kind of see this in the movie. And this is maybe another way that he's positioned as not being entirely wise, not being the final say on this idea. In fact, just being an example of some of the issues. Towards the end of what we see of the talk, his phone rings. And this really seems to shatter the aura, really seems to undermine his authority to some extent. Later, Juliette Binoche meets up with the author, and the rest of the movie is basically them hanging out. This starts with a trip in a car, which is reminiscent of the many car scenes in Taste of Cherry. The camera is mounted outside the car. You look through the windshield, which has a bunch of glare on it, so very aware of where the camera is mounted. This is not a very common way to film a scene in a car, but Again, Kiarostami, to some extent, tugging on the boundaries of movies and the grammar. Binoche is really nervous in the presence of the author, almost to the extent which I didn't really believe the character. She gets starstruck. She has some opinions, but she's no guru. At first, she seems she wants to make a bunch of claims about the work. She wants to disagree with things, but when the time comes for her to do that, she finds herself not having much to say. In this movie, you probably shouldn't expect any of the answers to be spoken by individual characters. There's a moment later on when an old Italian woman gives Juliet advice. And this is one of those times where it's sort of positioning the words as maybe seeming wise. The stage is set for something wise. But this is probably intended more as a comment on tradition and provincial wisdom than it's intended as a moral of the story or something that should be taken at face value, a claim that Kiarostami is making. This film does not spell out its conclusion, despite its themes being relatively straightforward. So themes, what are the themes? Well, copying and authenticity are the big ones, obviously, I guess. Seemingly, this movie is focused on art, the authenticity of art, original art. But I think it's actually more about relationships and the original and authenticity of those. If it doesn't make sense to think of relationships as being authentic or original, then just think about the value of a relationship. An original piece of art seems to have some sort of transcendental value. Of course, we're creating originals all the time. In some scope, in some context, everything we do is original, but certain things, for whatever reason, become minted as originals, right? Stamped as originals. Hold on. Anyway, minor distraction. Mainly by people who are making copies of them, right? What better way to make an original than to make a copy of it? In fact, that might be the only way to make an original. The copies solidify the significance of the original. The copies pale in comparison. Juliet asked James to sign 6 copies of his book for her. She gives him names for the first 3 and asks him to make them out to these people. The last 3 he just signs. And there's a bit of a hierarchy being established right here. The book that he signs for Juliet's sister, Marie, is the most valuable. He signs it, but he also writes a personal note in it. Then he signs 2 others to people, but just with their names. And then there are 3 with signatures, but not addressed to anybody. And then you have all the other books. There's kind of a hierarchy of value. It's funny how that works. The more valuable ones here are the more personal ones. They're the ones that are less like the others. In a relationship, meanwhile, when it's your relationship, it might seem to have a transcendental value, a similar concreteness as an original piece of art, more meaningful. Other things pale in comparison. We're looking for that real, authentic, original relationship and life. It isn't like all the relationships of the passers-by. It isn't like the relationships on TV. Now, the movie isn't necessarily claiming that either of these things are true, that there's a transcendental value of original art or of an original relationship. It also presents a lot of counterpoints. Juliet describes Marie, her sister, as being simple, as being someone who doesn't mind wearing imitation jewelry. She is content with copies. She doesn't see any additional value in an original. And James praises her for this, suggesting that it's a fulfilled life. Not merely sort of an ignorance is bliss situation, but something deeper than that, a deeper sense of contentment. He tells a story about a mother showing her son a statue. The statue is a copy, but the mother doesn't tell the son that, and he's in awe. Why does it matter if the statue is a copy or an original? Should she have told the son, or is it better that she didn't? They visit a museum where there's a painting that was once thought to be an original, but was later discovered. The museum had it for many, many years, thinking it was original, but it was eventually uncovered as a copy. The museum seems almost more enamored by the painting as a copy, almost proud that it's a copy because it links them to an interesting piece of history or something like that. So do we need to see the original to appreciate it? Maybe not. Some people might be content with illusions of value. In one of the villages, they bump into some tourists who are enamored by the fountains and the buildings, but there's an implication that they don't really know what they're looking at. They're tourists. Interesting line here. The tourists say that Italy, for them, is like one big open-air museum. That's why they love coming here. 1/4 of the world's artifacts are there, they say. Something like that. That's obviously false. Eurocentrism. Kiarostami, being an Iranian director, is including this Eurocentric remark very pointedly, purposefully, destabilizing the value of everything in the town, right? Both the copies and the original. How valuable can the copies really be? Or how much sense can the system really make when people like this come? Yeah, this is 1/4 of the value of the whole world is right here, when some of the things they're looking at are not old at all. Some of the things are mass produced. Some of the things aren't that significant. And when in positioning these things as being wholly significant, there may be eliding huge pieces of history elsewhere in the world. The system doesn't really seem to make as much sense, but they're content with some of these illusions of value. Just maybe like the people who come to see James's talk. They're content with the little performance that he gives. They're interested. They buy the book for one reason or another. It turns out that Juliet doesn't think too much of the book, although again, she seemingly has a bit of trouble engaging with it. So maybe you don't need the original. Maybe it has illusory value, or maybe you can be content with the illusory value of a copy, or maybe the thing that has illusory value is the original itself. What makes the original any more special than an identical copy? So maybe original art isn't so valuable after all. Maybe it isn't so significant. What about the original relationship? Well, when it comes to original relationships, authentic relationships, maybe it's too much to ask for. James and Juliet visit a town that is famous for weddings, and wherever they go, they see brides and grooms, in some ways, copy after copy of the same traditional imagery. You might think that your life and your relationship is original, but obviously it isn't. Your life is structured by imitation, shaped by institutions that you are interpolated into, right? You participate in this very actively in being like everybody else. That's one of the main things that gives us meaning, is being like other people. Of course, another thing is being different, but that's another story. The things of your life, they might seem joltingly real, valuable, and original. But most people also, from time to time, feel like they don't know what they're doing. They don't know why. They don't know each other. Like things are hollow. Like maybe it isn't all startlingly original. Like maybe my relationships are things I adopted out of convenience, things that made sense at one point, but didn't make as much sense later. So maybe they're copies. Is that enough? Can we get by with relationships that are copies? Will we ever have more? These are the central questions of the movie, I think. And the answer is the central ambiguous dynamic of the film, right? Which isn't to say that it's non-conclusive, but really it's just not that simple. The movie gives you an answer, but the answer is this ambiguous quagmire that confounds the film and the viewer. Like I said, pointed ambiguity used to tease out deep ideas in life. That's Abbas Kiarostami. So I said I'd come back to the phones. This movie's from 2010. I don't think it's a rant about phones, but they do show up a few times. For instance, there's a scene, this is a great scene, in the village with the fountain, where an old man appears to be berating his wife. But when the camera moves a bit, you see from another angle that he's actually yelling at someone on the phone while his wife sort of watches. A lovely piece of sleight of camera. Another trick from Kiarostami. Things are not what they seem. There's a lot of illusion in this film. The statue that is a copy, but that people don't realize is a copy. A lot of sleight of hand, a lot of illusion. Copies, are they an illusion? Relationships? Is that some sort of illusion? Something that looks good from one angle? Do we need these illusions? Do we depend on these illusions? Should we spurn them, or should we lean into them and enjoy them? In general, phones seem to puncture in this movie. They put on hold a number of deeper conversations. When James and Juliet have to take a call, for instance, it's a call from Juliet's family, it's a problem with their son, or it's a call from maybe the publisher, some business call for James, right? They seem to take them out of the authentic world, take them out of the moment, allowing them to be reached by the bosses even while on vacation, pulled out of this tiny town into some other space, not aligned with the authentic or the original, you would probably say. Sadly, Kiarostami died in 2016. I'm not sure what his movies would look like today if he was still making them. In some ways, some of our newer technologies, NFTs, the metaverse, fit in with these questions about authenticity, illusion, the value of the original, of art. He would have maybe had a field day with some of the things people do, with some of the tricks people play on themselves these days, and some of the tricks that he could play on us with some of modern contexts. On the other hand, this isn't a postmodern movie, really, like I said. He doesn't engage too much with that postmodern weirdness. 2010 really isn't that long ago. I mean, this isn't a movie about the internet. It could have been, but phones play a somewhat minor role. It's more or less a traditionally focused movie. So I don't know what he would be doing now if he were still making movies. But thankfully, when he was around, he gave us a ton of interesting things to think about. And this is no exception. Now, obviously, slowly paced movie. Like I said, it takes a different level of focus. If you have that, it's rewarding. If you don't, you'll hate this movie. But Kiarostami is fun. He's a little bit of a trickster. If you know what to expect, really engaging, fun experience, I think. And this is no different. So I highly recommend the film Certified, copy from 2010.